Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 435th episode, we have a bunch of news.
Yes, including maybe you heard about Phil Currie's Celebrating Dinosaurs paper that came out recently.
I did not hear about it, but I'm going to, it sounds like.
There's also another Tyrannosaurus skeleton up for auction.
And I've got a paper about Spinosaurus brains and what they might tell us about their behavior. We also have an interview with Gregory Paul, pretty famous paleontologist. You might be familiar. We often cite his dinosaur lengths estimates in our Dinosaur of the Day.
And weights.
Yep. And he also wrote that controversial paper about Tyrannosaurus rex being 3 species. So we're going to talk about that some. And we have Dinosaur of the Day, Tian Yulong. But before we get into all of that, we want to thank some of our patrons. And this week we'd like to thank Elijah, Geraldine, Bill Jago, Alone Dingo, Leo, the Georges family, Quadrasaurus, Trent Carbajal, Bruce, and Rocco Raptor.
Yes, thank you so much for being part of our Dino-It-All community. We really appreciate you.
And we've got that first episode of I Know Paleo available for all of our Triceratops and Up patrons, so make sure to check that out.
Jumping into the news, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Phil Currie wrote an amazing review article about the history of paleontology, what we know now about dinosaurs compared to when we humans first discovered dinosaurs, and where the field of paleontology is headed. And it's called Celebrating Dinosaurs, Their Behavior, Evolution, Growth, and Physiology. It was published in the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences, and that has free access if you want to check it out for yourself.
Oh, nice. Yeah, because I think most of the Canadian Journal ones are behind paywalls.
Yeah, but when you're celebrating dinosaurs, it's open to everyone.
Yeah.
So I'll give a quick overview of this paper. It's worth reading if you want more of the details and links to the papers because he cites a lot of sources in it. This paper also feels very fitting with our Gregory Paul interview, since both he and Phil Currie have so much influence on paleontology.
That's true, yeah. We do hear a lot of people talking about Phil Currie, too.
So Phil Currie starts with the history of paleontology. You know, humans, we found fossils a long time ago, but we attributed them to mythological animals like dragons or griffins. And then Megalosaurus was named in 1824, and Richard Owen coined the term Dinosauria in 1842. And at first, people were really interested in dinosaurs, as Currie put, quote, an initial period when public and scientific interest was insatiable, end quote. But then, quote, 2 world wars, political turmoil, and the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s put a damper on those interests, end quote.
That sort of collapsed all of the 1800s into one period. Because I would say like not 1824 or 1842 were people really interested in dinosaurs. But by the end of the 1800s, they were.
Definitely, because you got the Bone Wars. Then there wasn't much done between like 1930 and the late 1960s, though there was still some important field work going on, like expeditions in Mongolia, for example.
That's a good point, yeah. Yeah, there wasn't a lot in the news and a lot of public excitement going on, but you're right, there was stuff going on, especially in Asia.
Oh yeah, we did talk about, I guess, Roy Chapman Andrews and his expeditions, and he was generating some interest there.
Was that in the 30s or a little earlier?
I think that was the 30s.
Okay.
I'll have to go back to our Roy Chapman Andrews episode. It's been a while. But these discoveries, they kind of helped start the Dinosaur Renaissance, and public interest also stayed about the same in dinosaurs from like 1930s to 1970s. There's a lot of books and movies and toys and comics. Then you've got Sinclair using a sauropod as its logo and sponsoring the animatronic models and the life-size models at the New York World's Fair in 1964. So it's not like dinosaurs are totally forgotten here. Then you've got the Dinosaur Renaissance that starts in the late 1960s and goes to the early 1970s. And of course, we've got Bob Bacher as a big part of it. And he talks about warm-blooded dinosaurs and birds being dinosaurs, which we've mentioned before. Huxley talked about that in the 19th century. And others did build upon it, but the idea wasn't terribly widely accepted for a while.
Yeah, most of the paintings and depictions of dinosaurs, not just in popular media, but also the paleo art and the scientific understanding was big, lumbering, slow, reptilian, lizardy things.
Yeah. And then there's the idea of dinosaurs, some of them being feathered, and that's a huge deal. As Phil Currie put it, quote, he, meaning Bakker was greatly outnumbered by his colleagues, but in the long run, many of his ideas have prevailed, end quote. Then, of course, we've got Jurassic Park that came out, and that made dinosaurs even more popular. Attendance at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, for example, shot up by like 40,000 people after the movie came out. And Currie wrote, we had as many as 3 film crews a day at the museum during the summer of 1993.
Oh, wow.
Which he would know. He is affiliated with that museum.
He basically created it.
Mm-hmm. Quote, but more importantly, it also had a major impact on public education, which surprised me, end quote. Because he said that paleontologists, they started getting more questions about dinosaurs that were closer to the science instead of how they were portrayed back in like King Kong in 1933, for example. Dinosaurs have also grown in popularity around the world. There's parks, there's amusement parks, there's new museums coming up, and that means there's more opportunities for people to be inspired, and that leads to more paleontologists around the world and more discoveries, which we keep seeing. There's so many discoveries every year. And interestingly, he also said that dinosaur sessions at SVP, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which we started going to since every year since 2015, there weren't that many dinosaur sessions until 1988. And that's when it was hosted in Drumheller at the Tyrrell Museum. And since then, I think now it might be mostly dinosaur sessions at this conference.
There's certainly a lot. It's the largest set of sessions. It's at least a plurality, if not a majority.
Yeah. As we mentioned, the number of dinosaurs, too, just how many are named each year has increased because we started with just 3 in 1842 when Richard Owen coined Dinosauria. You got Hylaeosaurus, Iguanodon, Megalosaurus. I mean, they were named earlier, but we didn't think of them as dinosaurs until then. Richard
Owen was the one that combined those 3 together and said, these make up Dinosauria.
Yeah. Apparently in the 1960s, about 3 dinosaurs were named per year. But now we've got more than 1,000 species of dinosaurs named. Also in the 1960s, only about 40 people published at least one dinosaur paper during the whole decade. But Currie said, luckily, those people started taking on graduate students, so then you've got more research papers. And over the last decade, we've got several hundred publications each year on dinosaurs. Like, I don't think I can name everyone who has published a paper on dinosaurs.
Yeah. You didn't mention it, but sometimes now it's called the golden age of dinosaurs, the period we're in.
Oh, that's true. Good point.
Because there was a Dinosaur Renaissance, and then there was a little bit of a lull, then you had Jurassic Park, and that sort of kicked off the golden age, which is now when there are more discoveries happening than any time in history.
Mm-hmm. Then you got breakthroughs in technologies and just more and more people around the world getting interested. It's a good time. It's a good time for dinosaur enthusiasts. Currie also wrote, quote, it's no secret that everyone who likes dinosaurs when they're young do not become vertebrate paleontologists. Which, yeah, we do know. Otherwise, we'd have a lot more vertebrate paleontologists.
Probably more vertebrate paleontologists than would have work because almost every kid I know is interested in dinosaurs. We can't all have the same job.
Yeah. But a lot of people do remember how much they like dinosaurs, and they end up volunteering at museums or going on digs or helping in other ways like offering services or new technologies.
That's a good point.
And he wrote, quote, the use of ground-penetrating radar is still a dream in paleontology, notwithstanding its portrayal in the Jurassic Park movies. It has been experimented with Gillette and Meglich, and under the right circumstances should work fine, end quote, which was interesting to me to read about that.
I did a fun fact on that technology because I think the reason they used it in Jurassic Park was because that was basically a real tool that was being developed at the point. But the biggest problem is that the density of the rock and the density of the bones, which have turned into rock in that same rock, tend to be pretty similar because it's like by definition they're made out of the same rock.
So you can't really distinguish between.
Yeah, those things need to detect a difference in density is how they work, and if they're similar in density, then it's just not much to detect. But like they said, in the right circumstances, like maybe in a mudstone or something that might be more full of water in either the fossils or the rock, or if the rock changed more than the fossils changed or vice versa, then it can work.
Yeah, although it's still hard to get that equipment to the field.
It is, and it's one of those things too where it's like if you're looking over a field of, hundreds of acres for a fossil and it's going to be somewhere and the scanner does 50 square feet at a time, you're not going to go out there with a machine and like fire it off, move 10 feet, fire it off, move 10 feet. Like it would take forever. So, yeah.
So Not yet, anyway.
Yeah.
But there has been a lot of other advances in technology. Like now a lot of people do histology, that thin sectioning of the bones and teeth, and you study under a microscope, and then you learn things about like the growth rates of the dinosaurs. And then there's CT scans, which they don't destroy the fossils, and you've got 3D imaging and photogrammetry.
Yeah, I've got a fun fact about CT scanning.
Ooh. It's almost like we themed this episode.
Almost.
Also, more quarry sites have been excavated and mapped out, and more dinosaurs are being named based on higher quality specimens. We're now getting more of the skeleton than just, say, a tooth.
Mm-hmm.
And new technologies make it possible to study dinosaur skin and colors and other aspects and soft tissues. Jurassic Park also influenced in terms of molecular paleontology, like looking for genetic material in fossils like blood vessels and muscle fibers and melanosomes. And of course, some dinosaur feathers in amber have been found. They've been found in Alberta, Canada, as well as in some small dinosaurs in Myanmar.
I didn't realize that amber had been found in Canada.
I didn't either.
Huh.
But Phil Currie would know.
Yeah. The Myanmar stuff gets all the headlights.
Mm-hmm. In the early days, we weren't really considering growth series or individual variation in dinosaur species. But now we have some dinosaurs where enough skeletons have been found to show how they grew, how they changed from a hatchling to a juvenile to an adult.
And they changed a lot.
Oh, yeah. We've also found dinosaur bones on all continents in all kinds of environments: arid, islands, lake, polar. And there's more than 11,000 living species of birds, and comparing birds to dinosaurs, to the non-avian dinosaurs, helps us understand them better. As for dinosaur extinction, Currie wrote, quote, "In the first half of the 19th century, many people, including scientists, did not believe that any animals had ever gone extinct," end quote. So when dinosaur bones were first found, people thought that they were still alive somewhere in the world.
Yeah, the lost world hypothesis, I guess you could call it.
Yeah. But of course, now we know about the Chicxulub crater. And then Currie wraps it up with the future of paleontology and how it's becoming, quote, more international than it has ever been. And that's something we've talked about too, and it's exciting to see.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to get fossils found all over the world when there are fossil experts, also known as paleontologists, all over the world.
Yes.
And it's just nice because then people can keep the fossils near where they're from and they can get excited about it, and it builds on itself.
Definitely. There's also more female paleontologists. About 20% of researchers are female, which I didn't quite know the numbers before.
That's more than I expected. That's definitely a big increase over the last couple decades.
Yeah. And research teams are more multidisciplinary and multinational. And papers now, we've got multiple authors rather than single authors, typically.
We really like to see that.
Yeah. And more work's being done on smaller parts of the skeletons rather than looking at just the large skeletons overall. Like when you're doing histology, for example, you're looking at a teeny tiny part. And he wraps it up with, quote, "New discoveries will continue to fuel interest in the earth sciences and will continue to recruit new scientists from the young at heart," end quote.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's just overall a really nice paper, good overview if you're looking for some history on paleontology as well as a little bit about what we know about dinosaurs overall so far. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to dig in deeper into that article, we'll have a link in our show notes.
Yes.
And I've got, in my fun fact too, I also have a piece on a new piece of technology which could be used for learning more details about fossils.
Well then.
Yeah, it's like where CT scans are going. And up next, talking about CT scans, we've got a article about Spinosaur brains, which utilized that technology. It's published in the Journal of Anatomy, and this article is also open access.
Nice.
It was written by Chris Barker and others, and they were specifically looking at if they could see from a Spinosaur brain anything that indicated how or if Spinosaurs adapted, specifically in the brain, to eat fish.
So Spinosaurus and its relatives.
Not really Spinosaurus, it turns out. They were looking at Baryonyx and Ceratoseucops specifically, which is a group called Baryonychinae or Baryonychines. And I think they picked them because, as we know, Spinosaurus finds are famously fragmentary.
Yeah.
But we do have a couple of good brain cases or endocasts. And the brain case, as the name implies, is the part of the skull that holds the brain. Although with dinosaurs, it's not like our brain where the brain fills basically the whole space. There's a fair amount of empty space, like half to 2/3 might have been empty. But it still gives a pretty good idea about the general shape of the brain. And with CT scanning, you can see that nice structure without having to break it open. So it's gotten a lot more popular in the last couple decades.
Just like we said, CT scans don't destroy the fossil.
Yep. And some clever people that know a lot about brain anatomy, even though the brain doesn't fill the whole space, they can figure out how the brain regions vary from dinosaur to dinosaur and get some ideas about how their brains might have functioned. There's been one good previous brain case study on a Spinosaur, at least according to these authors, they pointed out, which is Irritator. Irritator. That name is so funny because it's just that they got annoyed when they were digging it out.
Yep. Not that the dinosaur was particularly irritating in life.
It's just that it must have been so frustrating for them to put that in as the name of the dinosaur. So Irritator is from the Aptian of Brazil, which puts it about 110 million years ago, which is about 10 million years before Spinosaurus, because that was about 100 million years ago. So this would have been significantly earlier than Spinosaurus. Irritator has, quote, unexceptional hearing capabilities, end quote. That was from a previous study that showed even though it couldn't hear that well, it did have adaptations for, quote, rapid and controlled pitch down movements of the head that perhaps aided in the predation of small and agile prey, such as fish, end quote.
All right.
So in other words, it was good at snapping its head down and closing its jaws quickly and precisely. But it doesn't have to be like a stork wading in water and snapping up fish. It could have been snapping up small terrestrial animals like dinosaurs or mammals.
Right, and some Spinosaurs have been found with terrestrial animals in their gut content.
Very true. So we don't know exactly, but it does seem like it is a function that would be useful if you're standing in water trying to catch fish.
Mm-hmm.
This new study examined, again, baryonychines, and they were looking at Baryonyx and Ceratoseucops. Baryonyx is about 20 million years older than Irritator, making it 30 million years older than Spinosaurus. It's about 130 million years old in the UK, and there have been some reports in Iberia, although it seems like almost all of those are getting renamed into other Spinosaurs, and the only ones that are left are pretty fragmentary, so it's like they got named Baryonyx because that was the closest thing at the time. But I'm kind of wondering if in the end, it might just settle out as Baryonyx is in the UK.
Right.
Everything in Iberia is either undetermined Spinosaurus or named to something else.
Like Baryonyx was this wastebasket taxon for a while.
Basically, yeah. As best as we can tell, Ceratoseucops is contemporary with Baryonyx. It was found just about 2 years ago from the Isle of Wight, also in the UK.
So it lived around the same time as Baryonyx?
Yeah, and probably the same place. They probably literally walked around together, but you can never be totally sure since they weren't found exactly together.
Not like the fighting dinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have much of Ceratoseucops, but we do have a brain case and the tip of the snout. That's basically all we have of it. But the brain case is what we're talking about here, so that's all you need.
You can learn a lot from the brain case.
Yep. Interestingly, the main takeaway is that the brains are pretty similar to other theropods. Although, quote, several differences of unknown taxonomic utility are noted between the pair, end quote. So in other words, there are some differences they can tell in the brain case, and therefore probably the brain. But we don't know if they were important or not, and if they were used for anything, but we might be able to figure that out in the future.
It's really hard to tell what goes on in the brain case of an animal that's been long gone. Yes,
very true, especially when the brain doesn't fill the whole thing. Like Irritator, they have an unexceptional feature, in quotes. But while Irritator has unexceptional hearing, Baryonyx and Ceratoseucops have unexceptional olfaction, or the ability to smell. So Baryonyx and Ceratoseucops seem to have better low-frequency hearing, which I guess makes it less unexceptional.
It's just regular exceptional.
Yeah. They had a mean hearing frequency of about 1500 hertz versus Irritator was about 1950 hertz, so a little higher up the spectrum. Although I did see somebody saying, well, maybe it was at a higher frequency because irritator was later. And if it was more adapted, like more on the aquatic side of the semi-aquatic spectrum, maybe that was a more useful frequency for hearing like splashing and things that might be useful if you're hunting in water. Very, very speculative guess there. But unfortunately for Ceratoseucops and Baryonyx, they might not have been as good at snapping down at prey due to the different floccular lobes that they had. And again, I think you were just talking about floccular lobes the other day. That's the part of the brain which is used for gaze stabilization during quick movements.
Mm-hmm. We're talking about that with an ankylosaur that wasn't very good with it.
Yeah, presumably. It's a kind of small part of the brain, so it'll be interesting to see in a few years how significant people still find this analysis, but we'll see. Overall, their brains were pretty similar. The major differences between Spinosaurs and other theropods were in their bodies and skulls, not in their brains, which the way the authors put it is that they already had the brain power necessary to, quote, transition from terrestrial hypercarnivorous ancestors to semi-aquatic generalists, end quote.
Oh, good for them.
I really like the description of Spinosaurs as semi-aquatic generalists, too.
Mm-hmm.
They don't define what a semi-aquatic generalist is anywhere, but I presume it means that they went after everything from fish to pterosaurs, since that's what we've found in Spinosaur guts, basically.
You eat what you can find.
Yep. And then the semi-aquatic just means that not only are they doing it on land, but sometimes they go into the water to include some fish in the diet.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, they also talked some about the reptile encephalization quotient, or REQ, basically the expected size of a reptile's brain based on its body mass, which is better than a simple ratio of brain mass to body mass, but it's only slightly better.
Mm-hmm.
And the measurement is often criticized for not being particularly meaningful. We were talking about that in the recent paper where they were talking about the baboon intelligence of Tyrannosaur, and they were trying to come up with a different way from reptile encephalization quotient, although that one wasn't particularly well received either.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in this case, REQ is okay because we're talking about animals that are really close in the family tree and close in size relatively too. So I think the more similar the animals are, the better of a comparison you get. Like you might not be able to tell the difference when you're trying to look at the difference between a bird and a dog and compare their brains. But if you're looking at the difference between a crow and a raven, which are really closely related, and one of them has some big difference in their brain, it's probably a more relevant difference.
Mm-hmm.
They estimated that the brain took up between 37% to 50% of the endocast for their calculation. And I'm just going to go with the 50% numbers because no matter which one you pick, they all sort of scale the same. So just
okay, keep
for
it simple.
convenience. Yeah. Baryonyx had an REQ of 1.6, which is similar to Majungasaurus and Ceratosaurus. So in other words, we think they had a similar encephalization or very roughly intelligence or maybe sensory abilities as those other terrestrial carnivores. They had a little bit more REQ than Giganotosaurus, which was at 1.4, although less than Allosaurus and Carnotaurus, which were about 2.1. And the highest of all was Tyrannosaurus at about 2.4.
Just adding to its apex predatorness.
Yeah, and its smartness. I don't know if 2.4 would be considered baboon-like. The interesting thing about REQ is that it's reptile encephalization quotient, so it can't be applied to mammals.
Right.
And I like the use of REQ. If you're going to use encephalization quotient, use at least one that's specific to that group of animals, because at least then you're comparing apples to apples, because there are differences in neuronal density and all sorts of things. The author said, quote, REQ values imply that baryonychines did not deviate substantially in terms of cognitive capacity and behavioral sophistication relative to other basal theropods, and these predators possessed unexceptional hearing and olfactory capabilities on par with several other large-bodied terrestrial theropods, end quote.
So their strengths were not hearing and smell, but they did well in other ways.
Yes, and they were also basically saying that the other predators weren't particularly exceptional either.
So it didn't matter.
Yeah, you can find specific ones, like some of them had better smell, some of them had better hearing in the list, but they were sort of just in the middle. There wasn't anything particularly standing out. They also said, quote, "There is no tangible evidence for adaptations to semi-aquatic ecologies in the baryonychine endocrania, suggesting that neural and sensory systems of spinosaurids were pre-adapted for the successful detection and capture of aquatic prey, or that the initial transition to semi-aquatic ecologies simply required modifications of the craniodental apparatus," end quote. So I think the way you could best summarize that is they were smart enough and their senses were good enough that they just needed the tools for catching fish.
Yeah.
Other than the longer snout with the more spear-like teeth, that was like the main thing they needed. And then all of a sudden they could hunt fish.
Which fits with them being generalists.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like they went after fish because there were plentiful fish available, presumably, for them to hunt.
Yeah.
But they weren't going to say no to the food that they had been eating and their ancestors had been eating. So, yeah, it just sort of spread out into the semi-aquatic. And then maybe over time they got more and more aquatic. But I don't know if we have a Spinosaurus brain case that we can look at. We might. Maybe we'll see a later paper, because that's another 10 million years later, and there have been proposals that it was more adapted to aquatic lifestyle.
Maybe that's one of the things that Nizar Ibrahim is hinting about, because he's always hinting that he's got something big.
That's true, yeah.
Our last news item is a quick one, and thank you to our listeners who shared this one with us. Trinity the Tyrannosaurus is going to be auctioned off in Switzerland next month.
Was that one that was on display recently?
The name sounds vaguely familiar, but...
Oh, I might be mixing it up with Trix.
Or Tristan.
There's a lot of T's.
Yeah.
I guess because it's a T-Rex, so they want to start it with a T.
So Trinity is about 67 million years old and is expected to sell for 5.4 to 8.6 million US dollars. Trinity's about 38 feet long and almost 13 feet tall, so 11.6 meters long and 3.9 meters tall. Trinity, though, is composed of 3 specimens, so kind of like Dippy that way.
Weird.
An amalgamation, yeah. The fossils were found in the Hell Creek and Lance Creek formations between 2008 and 2013, and about 50% of the bones are original. So we'll hear more because the sale is happening April 18th. See how much Trinity actually goes for.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe I should, since we're right about to talk to Greg Paul, I should call it Tyrannosaurus, not T-Rex.
Yeah.
Like you did. Even more so if it's 3 different individuals smushed together. And speaking of Greg Paul, we're going to get onto that interview in just a moment. But first, we're going to pause for one quick sponsor break. And now, on to our interview of Gregory Paul. But as always, we have an extended version of this interview. So if you're interested in hearing more talk about all of the many things he has worked on over the years, I highly suggest going to our Patreon and checking out our premium content extended version of the interview. We are joined this week by Gregory S. Paul, who's a researcher, author, and illustrator who's made major contributions to the field of paleontology. Among many things, he's known for his research on theropods, his books including Predatory Dinosaurs of the World and the Princeton Field Guide to Dinosaurs, his work in documentaries and movies including Jurassic Park and When Dinosaurs Roamed America, and of course his art. He was part of the Dinosaur Renaissance, and his work helped show dinosaurs as more active and bird-like. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, you're more than welcome, and I'm happy to do so.
So there's a lot we want to talk about with all your research and work and everything, but I am curious what exactly got you into dinosaurs, because you started working with dinosaurs in sort of a lull in American paleontology, of at least research in dinosaurs. There weren't a ton of dinosaur paleontologists when you got going. So what was it that drew you to the subject?
Well, in terms of why I got into dinosaurs, I was a kid.
Yeah.
And pretty much stayed on it. And I had some other ideas of things I might do, but I didn't really pursue them. And the important thing is that Northern Virginia Community College, there was a guy named Terry Dyroff who taught geology, a young fellow. He was a great guy. Still in touch with him, actually. He knew a woman who was at the Smithsonian in the Natural History Museum. And she told me I should contact Nicholas Houghton. He used to be the reptile guy there, the fossil reptiles guy. And I did, and he was a terrible procrastinator. It took him half a year to get back to me. He invited me to come down and visit in the back areas, which is really thrilling. I was, 20 years old. And I lived in Northern Virginia near the Smithsonian. I went there, started as a kid. A very important thing, the Materna's murals were there, the fossil mammal murals.
Oh, nice.
These spectacular giant paintings he did. They're all gone now because they redid the fossil hub. They've been shipped off to other places. But those are a huge inspiration for my art. And when I went down, I was really lucky. Guess who was there visiting that day? Jack McIntosh.
Oh.
Dinosaur Theropod McIntosh. And I was showing him my art. And of course, Jack is one of the nicest guys in the world and that sort of thing. And he was very encouraging. So I started volunteering there. And then I heard that Robert Bacher was at Hopkins. And then in 77 to early 77, there was this great Nova dinosaur program, the Hot-Blooded Dinosaurs, which is the first dinosaur documentary ever done. And we got to see all the people for the first time. These people who, we'd been reading their papers. And I thought Bacher out of Harvard and Yale was a button-down guy. And I saw him for the first time. He looks like Rasputin. And it was just really outrageous.
He's very different in person.
Contacted him and started working with him and going up to Hopkins. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Nice. So it sounds like you started with art more than doing any sort of work with dinosaurs themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, but I was also interested in the science from early on. There was a thing where I was thinking of doing murals like Materna's, and I kind of poked my nose into that, but a lot of it's very political, and that wasn't going very far. Also, don't like heights and being up on the scaffolding. So I just got more and more into the science because I was hanging out at Hopkins and starting to do scientific work. So I blended both. And where I was different is that most paleo artists, they do what the paleontologists tell them to do. But I've been always much more independent and I've got my own ideas about dinosaurs and how they appear and so on. A very important thing happened with Bacher the first time I met him at Smithsonian was everybody else I'd shown to paleontologists said, "Oh, your art's wonderful, blah, blah, blah." And Bacher started criticizing and saying, "No, this isn't right," and blah, blah, blah. And I appreciated it. He was the first guy who took it seriously and knew what he was talking about. That was a very important thing. And I think the second time I came up to Hopkins, I think the first time I came up, he invited me to illustrate his upcoming book on dinosaurs, which he didn't do. But that started getting me to do the stuff on Coquille board in a more professional manner.
Nice. So you were working with Bacher from the very beginning, it sounds like.
Well, Bacher was at Hopkins from 76 to 84, and I met him in 77, and he wasn't going to get tenure, so didn't even try, and he left. So that was the period I was hanging out with him. We never published any papers together, and he was not the easiest professor to work with in a certain sense. He had issues with that. But it was very productive in a way. I learned a lot about how to do science, and also from a somewhat edgier manner, looking at things not in the standard establishment ways and that sort of thing. So yeah, I worked with him until he left in 84. But one of the important things I did at the time was 1980. I started saying that dinosaur artists up till then had been doing caricatures in general. They weren't doing it rigorously, both for the art and the restorations and for mass estimates. In 1980, I started doing the skeletal restorations I've become well known for. And that was to try to start doing them uniformly, standard criteria, so at least in relation to each other, they're comparable and that sort of thing. I visited Hopkins for the first time shortly after I met Bacher at the Smithsonian. So I'm up in his lab, and he's showing me a bunch of his drawings, and included it was a galloping triceratops done in the black, solid black with the white bones and all that. And I really liked that. I said, I'm going to start using that. And just as on the side, I think I don't know where he got that idea from, but Charles Knight had done it in the late 40s in a book called Animal Action and Anatomy for Artists, something like that, done an Indian elephant and a camel. And then William Shealy, in his classic 3-part books with charcoal drawings of prehistoric animals, he did some dinosaurs like that too. And Bacher may have picked that up from that. And I should ask him at some point. I'm not really in touch with him much, but I should try to find out at some point. So I started doing that. One of the helpful things about doing that sort of thing, we had the profile of the animal in the flesh on the bones, and it's very good for translating into clay models or whatever to do mass. There's that mass estimate for Brachiosaurus, the tend to grew 80 tons, which is not right. And I did the skeletal restoration using the detailed illustrations of the bones from the Janisch publications from Germany. And it turns out to be more like 30 to 35 tons. So that's one of the things I was trying to do back in those days.
Yeah, we still very often cite your work with mass estimates because for a lot of these dinosaurs, you're the one that has maybe done the one and only mass estimate, put your nickel down on a skeletal reconstruction and given a good estimate for it. So we appreciate that.
Yes.
Well, one of the things is that the dinosaur and the other field guides that have been doing for Princeton University Press are selling pretty well. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of citations cite Paul in one of those field guides for a mass estimate. I mean, the only thing they cite, but people see that. Oh, what's that about? And, I'm going to get that book.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm pretty sure that's one of the reasons those things are selling quite well.
So it was a good marketing move, it turns out, all these years later.
By accident.
Yeah.
Free advertising. I had no idea that was going to happen.
Yeah.
Speaking of books, you've been very prolific. Just in last year, 2022, you had 3 books come out. It was the Princeton Field Guide to Mesozoic Sea Reptiles, the Princeton Field Guide to Pterosaurs, and then the Princeton Field Guide to Dinosaurs, 2nd edition.
Well, the 2nd edition goes actually way back. That goes back to 2016.
Oh, okay.
It's obsolete. Don't buy that version. I actually had somebody recently say, I bought that version. I said, the 3rd edition is going to come out maybe the end of the year.
Oh, nice.
I'm actually finding out it's being harder to get this thing done because there's just so much new stuff. I hadn't quite realized I'm really going to.
Yes, it's hard to keep up.
But it might be out later this year or early next year. And it's going to have lots of cool new stuff in it and a fair number of revisions. For example, I know what Plateosaurus looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Plateosaurus, the old prosauropod.
Mm-hmm.
There's some new skulls published recently, including some big adults, and it's got a really kind of fun elongated skull that we didn't know about.
Yeah, I remember. I think we saw that maybe at SVP, a new reconstruction of it. And yeah, there was an assumption that these missing bones looked a lot different than they did. That's always so cool.
It's a publication that came out where they just have a bunch of skulls from different quarries, and they're trying to decide whether they're one species or not. And some of the skulls are like 400 millimeters plus long.
Wow.
And they belong to the biggest skeletons. And it's a stouter skeleton with this kind of funny long snout going out the front. The skulls we've all seen are actually half-grown animals. So it looks definitely fun.
That's cool.
It is.
I love it when things change.
Makes it hard to write books.
Well, I also one of the reasons I like doing the skeletals is because that's when I really get an idea for the first time what a lot of dinosaurs look like. And that's one of the things so I started doing them back in the early 80s. And the first one I did was Tyrannosaurus. And then pretty soon what later called Giraffatitan, which I misnamed. I shouldn't have called it Giraffatitan.
What would you have rather called
I
it?
should have called it Twigatitan.
Twigatitan.
For eating twigs?
Twigatitan. Because I wanted to name it after the African animal that looks like. But that animal's from Tanzania, that specimen. And that fossil collection was done under really bad colonial conditions. The Germans were very nasty in East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I should have used the Swahili word for giraffe, Twiga.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I love it when the local languages get tied into dinosaur names now. It makes them so much more evocative, and it tells you more of the history of the animal, too.
Yeah.
But Giraffatitan is a good name.
Yeah.
I think that
I like it, too.
Yeah.
And I'm going to rename the Utah Suppose Alamosaurus sanjuanensis. And I'm going to try to rename that thing because it's not the same. That species is all over the place, extending for about 2 million years. It's ridiculous. And I'm going to name it after Utah, and I'm also going to do the species name after my grandmother, who grew up in Huntington, Utah, 20 miles from that quarry back in the early 1900s.
Oh, that's nice.
That's really nice, yeah.
Vela Guyman Dewey. She lived to be 100 years old.
Wow. That's amazing.
And that's what's the greatest defect of Jurassic Park. That's the most obvious thing that when you first see the rearing Brachiosaurus, what's outrageous about that scene?
Oh.
Its huge head?
We were just talking about the subject. If that's Park just started up, all you'd have are juveniles.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good point.
I've never really heard anybody mention that.
Since you brought up Jurassic Park, some of our listeners had questions about it because you were somewhat involved in the dinosaurs.
Definitely had an influence.
Yeah.
I was the main designer for the Tyrannosaurus, although they altered it substantially to copyright it. And but I was the main designer for that, and Michael Tursick did the full-size thing of that. I had nothing to do with that last Brachiosaur because that was an ugly thing. It's out of a cereal box as far as I'm concerned. And those big Brachiosaurs were elegant animals. They were really gorgeous animals. They ruined that.
Was there, so of the T-Rex, was there anything specific that you...
It's not T-Rex for multiple reasons. And did you have a chance to read my bioarchive paper on Tyrannosaurus, the species?
We did, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We now know what they look like. You could tell them apart visually. It'd be like telling species of sparrows apart. It'd be actually pretty easy. They have those porcelain bosses. They're very distinct between the species. And the JP Tyrannosaurus has nothing to do with reality in terms of the display things. Mm-hmm. So it is not maybe it's a Tyrannosaurus, but it doesn't belong to any known species.
So it was based on the AM and H one. I'm trying to remember which species in your paper that...
We don't know.
Okay.
That's the only specimen now we can't pin down. A reason, they were complaining, well, you can't identify like 4 skulls. I think it was 4. And we can identify the other 3 now. It's that one is a strange specimen. We don't know what level it's from. It's missing the limiter that you really need to help diagnose these things. And the posterior bosses are kind of weird. They're kind of sort of doing its own thing. And, maybe it's a different species, but you can't name it because you don't know the stratigraphy and it's too incomplete. Or maybe it's a transitional thing. But these things are evolving. And so there's a lot of complexity going on in there with the Tyrannosaurus.
Yeah, I think after your paper, there was a lot of immediate knee-jerk opposition. And then we did see a lot of people saying, well, we all do kind of agree that Tyrannosaurus, as previously called Rex, was multiple species, but we just can't really decide where to draw the lines. And it seems like that's what most of the argument is about, is this enough statistical evidence to break down these are Tyrannosaurus Rex, these are Imperator, and these are Regina, or is it still we need more fossils territory?
Well, no, we don't need it. In the title for the original one, I said that there was subtle evolution. It's not subtle. Those bosses are screaming at us. And what happened is Scott and I were, after we published the original stuff, and that's actually, while doing the 3rd edition of the field guide, I've been looking at the papers of some new dinosaur species. And a lot of the criteria for these are a lot less than we used for that thing. And in the bioarchives paper, we detail how actually we're doing it at about the same level as for Triceratops that people keep citing in terms of the characters. And people saying, well, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap between the Triceratops species, between the characters. People are just ignoring that sort of thing. And we have about the same number of characters too now. But anyway, we were kind of saying, well, we should look more at the skull, and we're finding stuff. And I was idly looking at B-Rex, an image on the computer screen. I said, that's funny. There's this bar, the interpenifortal bar between the antorbital fenestra and the auxiliary antorbital thing. I'm looking at that saying, boy, that's a broad bar in that thing. Just kind of the back of my brain. And I said, well, I ought to check out, since that's from below in the formations, I ought to check out what did Regina, Stan and so on look like, Stan in the MRI specimen. There, it is incredibly thin. Bingo. And so I looked them out and they sort out. Only the lower stuff has the thick bars. Regina has thin, and Rex is kind of in between. And that got me and I made a mistake in doing the earlier work. I, for some reason, didn't pay attention to Tuftslot, that really great skull. Not sure why.
It's all the way Washington.
Well, it's actually not been published. There are photographs on the web, but it's not been published officially. And that sorts out as a Rex. Okay, now I can place it, plus the maxilla proportions are Rex in terms of the depth and length and all that stuff. Don't have post-credit for that. Okay, it's a Rex. And I was looking at that idly on the computer screen, a little bit bored, and said, wait a second. Those post-orbital bosses are weird because they're the kind of disc-shaped things that project well above the skull. And I was saying, what else looks like there's something else? Got another Rex. Those are the only 2 specimens that have that, and they're both high up. You look at Sue, it's long and nose. Sue has this long spindle-shaped post-orbital bosses that are massive, but don't project very high. And they go from the frontal back onto the squamosal process of the postal. They're very long, spindle-shaped. And those are only found in low specimens. That is screaming species, stratigraphically separated. Obviously, they could recognize each other. May not have, because almost they overlapped in time. But that's everything you need in that species.
Is there, I forget the holotype of T-Rex. How good is the skull for comparison, the one in Carnegie?
Well, that's the post-orbital, darn it.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fairly good skull. It's enough to diagnose the genus and the species too, because it's got a maxilla which is robust, and the femur is robust and that sort of thing. So it's not a bad specimen. But also we have to be careful about those things because this may have varied between the boys and girls, and ontogeny too. And if you look at birds, a lot of fair number of birds have crests and that sort of thing. It's generally the males have the more spectacular crests. The females, even though they're kind of similar, they're usually less, like hornbills have crests and that sort of thing. One exception is cassowaries. For some reason, the females have bigger crests. And they have something to do with the males are the ones who actually incubate the eggs more than the females.
Oh.
Not sure what that means. But in general, it's probably a male character that these really spectacular birds, these bosses. So maybe the T-Rex type was a female. Maybe we wouldn't see this. Well, maybe we would, but we'll never know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, your more robust individual was the Regina. Is that right? Am I remembering?
That's the gray saw one. Regina is all the gray saws.
Okay.
And some people are going to say, well, but maybe that's just the sexual morph of a Rex. Not impossible by any means. But that never happens before in Tyrannosaurids. And, you have a lot of specimens of Tyrannosaurid specimens, Gorgosaurus, Albertosaurus, Pletosaurus, Tarbosaurus, and so on, the big ones. And they never show much variation in the femur. And in the paper that Currie et al. Did as rebuttal, they were arguing, well, there's more variation in modern bird species, but that's comparing apples to oranges. Nobody's ever done that before. We're looking at the fossil record and what that tells us. It's consistently robust, the femur, in earlier Tyrannosaurids. And this is something I didn't realize. I assumed when I started this idea in 2010 at the Pittsburgh SVP meeting, because I was listening to Scannella talk on Triceratops, I just normally assume that Tyrannosaurus is the big, massive thing. It's going to start out gray cell like the earlier Tyrannosaurs and become robust. That was blown when I first looked up Sioux, usually getting up home. That's from the bottom of the Hell Creek. It's robust.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of thinking, well, this isn't going to work out. But then after you finally realize the gray cells are all high up. So this is something very weird, very unique that happens only at the end of Tyrannosaurids.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I like what you said about, maybe there is a possibility that there's sexual dimorphism. It seems like every single person is trying to find that first good example of sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs, because we still don't really have a slam dunk example. There seems to be a new proposal like every couple of weeks. But yeah, it's so hard to tease apart these differences. And is there individual variation? Is it a new species? Is it sexual dimorphism? And eventually you just got to publish what you think the most likely answer is and see how it shakes out.
That may be happening with some Imperator, in that you have some specimens with the very well developed bosses, and those may be the males, and then you have specimens where it's not so apparent those may be the females. But that you're probably going to need a bigger sample size over time to ship that out.
Yeah, and big sample sizes in paleontology are very difficult to go together.
Yeah.
It helps that T-Rex is so valuable, so every time anyone sees even the tiniest piece of it, they collect as much as they can.
Yeah.
When you're doing dinosaur illustrations, how do you decide how to illustrate parts that are unknown?
Well, generally, you if you can, you put it in from something that's a close relative, if you have to do that. And of course, one of the ways you avoid doing that is doing what I call known bone only illustrations. Scott Hartman calls them rigorous, but actually you often don't know what's missing or not. Sometimes you know exactly what is it or isn't. But even a lot of the old plaque mounts, classic plaque mounts, you can take the photograph and do a nice skeletal from it. You don't really know what is real and not in that they may have sculpted some of the stuff.
Yeah.
So I call them known bone only, which even itself is a bit off because you sometimes don't know. So that's one way to avoid that. I do that fairly often. It simplifies doing the skeleton and makes it quicker to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically comparative anatomy, look at something similar and hope to put the best. That's when they find more of it, that's going to hold up reasonably well, and maybe if you need to alter it.
Yeah.
The skeleton. Now, I'm updating my stuff all the time, both skeletals and even both color scenes. I'll redo them quite a bit over time to keep up with things.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love I like known bone only. We've seen dinosaur mounts in a few museums where they even do that in the 3D reconstructions, where basically rather than painting the plaster and trying to get it to look as much like the other fossil bones as possible, they just leave it straight white. And then you can see very clearly which part are the actual fossils and which part are being interpreted, which I love because I have the same problem as you. I'm looking at some of these mounts sometimes and I'm like, is that tail really the tail? Or how much of this is guesswork or comparative anatomy, because sometimes it's important when you're trying to figure out differences between dinosaurs.
The old story was that the American Museum, they used to be pretty different, the bones that were real and the ones that were plaster, that there was strong color contrast. And the story was, I'm not sure entirely it was true, was Ned Colbert had everything painted over to make it all look consistent so you couldn't tell anymore.
Bummer.
Good old Ned. I knew him fairly well. He was a great guy.
It does make them look prettier. I can see from like a general appeal that it looks a lot nicer. It doesn't look like an unfinished thing that's unpainted. But from a scientific or a real big dinosaur fan, when you go in there, it's nice to be able to see what's dug out of the earth versus pushed together out of lumps of plaster.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the last 20 years? Well, you've already said that you update your illustrations regularly, but is there anything in particular that's made you really change your illustrations, or has it been more of a little bit at a time, little details changing?
Oh, one of the things was that back in the 80s and 90s, when I was putting feathers on dinosaurs, people were outraged. How are you doing that? You don't have the evidence for that. And the argument was that you have to have the feathers preserved before you can do it. And I was saying for a lot of these dinosaurs, we don't have the scales.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have scales for a lot of the smaller stuff. And saying, well, it's pretty obvious that these are bird relations. And probably the feathers started earlier. Very good argument, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, in 96, the Spinosaur specimen came out. And I was there at the meeting in New York when Phil Currie had the first photographs and John Ostrom saw them for the first time and so on. Since then, I was actually not putting enough feathers on all of the dinosaurs. So I've had to put more on a fair number of them. So that's been a significant change. Well, there was one thing that in the last 20 years is that the lower arms of these things couldn't rotate as much as I assumed. So I had to put the hands in that position where the hands are flat on in lateral view rather than looking at them the same way as you do the toes when you're looking at lateral view.
The clappers, not slappers.
Yeah, something like that.
If say they were going to go back and remake a dinosaur movie like When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth or 1 Million Years BC, one of those kind of older movies, and you were able to work on it, is there any particular movie you'd want to go back and work on?
I don't know. Now, what's the best movie that features dinosaurs that's ever been done? Which one is it?
Well, I really love the really old Willis O'Brien stuff with the puppets.
Mm-hmm.
But
the original King Kong.
Yeah.
And I love that movie. And I saw that when I was like 5 years old on the television. And at the time I was saying, this is a really not very well done movie because even by the standard of the time, it looked a bit off. But I didn't realize it had been done in 1933. But it's beautifully artfully done. It's a great movie in terms of the pace of the movie. It really moves very fast and it's really cool.
Yeah.
And also fairly racist too, actually.
Yeah.
But that's back then. Yeah, you really can't, those dinosaurs are just really neat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Tyrannosaurus is dragging its tail, but I don't want to change it to the modern one and for that. So I guess I wouldn't want to do that. Now, there's a funny thing. Ray Harryhausen, I heard an interview of him around the turn of the century. He was an old guy and he was interviewed and it's on NPR somewhere. Maybe on Science Friday, but maybe Fresh Air with Terry Gross. But anyway, he was saying this stuff about the dinosaurs having their tails in the air is just a fad. And they'll go back to their tails on the ground. And that's because it's the way he loved them. And of course, even by then, we had gajillions of dinosaur trackways. There's never been an actual positive tail drag mark ever found. And so he's wrong about that. But I found that very interesting. He just was wedded to that old view of the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's, how that guy named Hitchcock who found the first trackways from New England and identified them as birds back in the 1800s. The reason he did that, they didn't have tail drag marks. So, well, they must be birds. They're free-toed. They don't have tail drag marks, so they must be birds because birds don't have tail long enough. But had they had tail drag marks, he probably would have said, oh, these aren't birds or something like that. So it's interesting, the lack of tail drag marks are why he called those things birds.
Yeah,
yes.
That's a good point. For our listeners, is there a good place for people to go to keep up with you and your work? I'm guessing maybe your personal website?
Yeah, go to the website. It's, I'm not a fantastic website, but I'm not really into that stuff that much. And I don't want to publish a lot of stuff online because I want people to buy those books, to be frank about it. So, yeah, you can always go to my website and, what's it? GSP, AUL, GSPaulDino.com. But that's about it for that,
Cool. Yeah. And get your books.
Yes. All the books.
Bet.
Thanks so much for chatting with us.
Yeah. Thank you.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much again, Greg, for letting us chat with you and talk to you about all of your work as well as your recent work with the Tyrannosaurus species. And thanks for also answering a bunch of our listener questions.
And in just a moment, we'll get on to our dinosaur of the day, Tianyulong. But first, we're going to pause for one last sponsor break.
And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Tianyulong, which was a request from Velociraptor256 via our Patreon and Discord. So thank you. It was a heterodontosaurid ornithischian that lived in the late Jurassic in what is now western Liaoning province, China. It looked somewhat similar to Heterodontosaurus, with the long legs and a long tail. It had a short skull, but it had shorter arms and a shorter neck. It probably walked on two legs, and like other heterodontosaurids, it had a pair of large canine-like tusks. And heterodontosaurids, they get their name because they have different teeth.
Mm-hmm. That's literally what it means. Hetero is different, and dont is teeth.
Different teeth lizard.
Yep. And then swords, because everything ends in sword.
So Tianyulong had unusual proportions compared to its heterodontosaurid relatives, with a large head, long legs and tail, but the short arms and the short neck. The holotype that was found was mature. It was a mature specimen, and it's estimated to be about 27.5 inches or 70 centimeters long, and that's based on comparisons to its relative Heterodontosaurus tucki. The skull was similar in shape to Heterodontosaurus, and the skull is about 2.3 inches or 6 centimeters long.
Oh, that's tiny.
Yes, but its tail is about 17 inches or 44 centimeters long.
Sounds big by comparison, but that's still pretty
It's still small, but it's got a long tail.
When you're measuring dinosaurs in inches.
Yeah.
In centimeters rather than feet and meters.
Yeah. Yeah, a little different from what we normally talk about. Now, the arms of Tianyulong are less than 30% the length of the legs. Its tail is similar, interestingly, to Dromaeosaur theropods, with a more mobile base and the middle and end being more rigid, and that may have helped it with balance. It also had a long second finger, and it may have been good at grasping. The heterodontosaurids were herbivores and maybe omnivores. They have bills for cropping and well-developed cheeks, which is good for eating plants.
Yeah, of all the dinosaurs, they have the most going on in their mouth, I think.
Yeah.
Because they got like the big canine teeth, they got the other like grindy type teeth, then they have a beak on top of it.
Yeah.
It's like that is a lot going on in that mouth.
The type and only species for Tianyulong is Tianyulong confuciusi. These fossils were found in Jianchang County, and they're now at the Shandong Tianyu Museum of Nature. The skeleton was one of those where it was like flat on a slab of rock. The genus name means Tianyu dragon, and it refers to the Tianyu Museum of Nature, and the species name is in honor of Confucius. It was named in 2009 by Zheng Xiaoting and others, and it's the first heterodontosaurid found in what is now Asia. Originally, they thought it was from the early Cretaceous, but then later they found it to be from the Tiaojishan Formation about 158.5 million years ago. The holotype's an incomplete skeleton, including part of the skull and jaw, vertebrae, part of the arm, part of the pelvis, part of the legs and feet, and long filamentous integumentary structures, basically possible proto-feathers or something like feathers.
Cool.
Yeah, in 2012, Paul Serino did a study of heterodontosaurids and also described a second specimen of Tianyulong. And this second specimen includes a nearly complete skull, vertebrae, part of the tail, shoulders, most of the arms, and parts of the legs and feet. And the holotype and second specimen are about the same size. There's also at least 4 other undescribed specimens. Serino said that all the specimens need to be studied to have a reliable skull reconstruction. But the most interesting part of these finds are the feather-like structures. So they found 3 patches of long filamentous structures on the back, neck, and tail. And these structures look similar to proto-feathers. They're not quite a feather, though the feathers are flexible and they have veins, and the structures on Tianyulang are stiff and they don't have veins, which are the flat part on the side of a shaft of a feather. These are instead single structures with no branches. But it's really unusual to find an ornithischian with feathers, or feather-like structures. Usually you find feathers on saurischians, mainly theropods. They're the ones with the evidence of the feathers. Ornithischians, though, they include ankylosaurs, stegosaurs, ceratopsians, hadrosaurs, and heterodontosaurs. So we don't generally think of these dinosaurs as having feathers.
Mm-hmm.
But we do have Psittacosaurus, another ornithischian. It's a ceratopsian with bristles on its tail.
Yeah, it's very similar to the way you were describing it, where it's sort of a down the middle of its back kind of thing, and big, kind of like huge, bristly hairs almost. They look more like a hair than they do like a feather.
Yeah, well, so the patches on Tianyulang are similar to the bristles on Psittacosaurus. They are also similar to structures found on some theropods like Sinosauropteryx and Beipiaosaurus. They are more similar to the bristles on the tail of Psittacosaurus, though, than to the protofeathers and theropods, though the structures on the tail of Psittacosaurus are more rigid and more widely separated from each other, so there's some differences. The structures on the tail of Tianyulang are the longest. They're about 60 millimeters long, which is 7 times the height of the tail vertebra. These structures were definitely not for flight, but they were possibly for display.
Highly probably for display.
Yeah.
Unless it was like a walking boot scraper or something. Why else would you have these big showy things sticking up?
But finding these structures opens up new questions like whether ornithischians independently evolved these structures, or were these structures part of the common ancestor of ornithischians and saurischians? Like, did all dinosaurs evolve from an animal that had something like this?
Probably.
And just adding to the debate, heterodontosaurs are basal ornithischians, so things for future research to figure out or tackle.
Yep. I mean, I think the most widely accepted view now is that the common ancestors of not only all dinosaurs, but also pterosaurs probably had feathers, because we see protofeathers or pycnofibers, depending on your preference on pterosaurs.
Yeah. Well, now, but this was back in 2012. This opened up like a whole new possibility.
For sure, especially when you combine it with Psittacosaurus. And our fun fact of the day is that the technology to look inside dinosaur skulls without breaking them open is over 50 years old, but it wasn't regularly used until more recently.
Oh.
And of course, I'm talking about CT scanning.
I didn't realize it had been around that long.
Yeah, the story of where CT scanning came from is actually pretty fascinating. So one of the inspirations behind CT scanners was a desire to look through Egyptian pyramids for hidden passages.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to destroy those pyramids.
And it's just so hard, like, you can't see all the things, it's just like a huge dense rock. It's hard to figure out where these things could be. And yeah, like you said, you don't want to just start like knocking down chunks. And it's probably really unsafe. You can't just go inside a pyramid and start like removing rock and, hoping to find a tunnel. So British engineer Godfrey Hounsfield was considering if it was possible to scan pyramids, basically, in the 1960s. And he talked about looking inside a box without opening it and like what technology you could use to do that.
That is a good way to describe it.
Yeah, getting rid of the whole Schrodinger's cat thing. Eventually, he came up with the idea of a CAT scan. Back then, they were called CAT scans, or computed axial tomography. Now we just call them CT scans or computed tomography. They're not quite as axial, I guess, because you can move them in more ways. They both function as a bunch of X-rays compiled together to make a better image. So CT scans themselves are literally just X-rays in terms of physically what's happening. It's the computer that's behind it which makes it a CT scan. It's doing a whole bunch of X-rays and then putting it through some fancy calculations, and then you have this resultant CT scan. There isn't anything like really magical about a CT scanner. It's just an X-ray. It's the computer that really is where the magic happens. Early on, the plan was to use the scans to look through skulls at brains, but in humans, not in dinosaurs. And it is exactly how researchers just did it with these dinosaur brain cases we were talking about with Spinosaurs. Although in the dinosaur case, There's no brain inside to see, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different because it's more like we're looking at the bone than we're looking at the brain. The original use was literally looking at the brain. They didn't care about the skull around it. In fact, they were trying to ignore the skull and look at just the brain. The researchers tried to use human brains preserved in formalin, but the formalin had hardened the brains, so they weren't useful for testing and calibrating and originally designing the machine. Interestingly, they ended up using kosher cows because the slaughtering process of kosher cows gave the best quality brains for scanning.
Oh, wow.
The way that other cows were slaughtered basically messed with the brains a little bit.
Huh.
And then it was giving them weird issues.
Something I never would have thought about.
Yeah. So all that work was basically in the 1960s. There was a parallel set of research going on elsewhere, but this is the one that led to the first clinical CT scan, which was done in 1971. It's really not too long after the idea and the early work on it. The first scan was done on a woman suspected to have a brain tumor, and the CT scan had really garbage, you could call it like potato camera level resolution. It was 80 by 80 pixels.
Oh, yeah, you can't. Can you tell anything from that?
When you know what a brain is supposed to look like, and you have that as a template, it's enough.
Okay.
Because when they looked at it, they could see a large dark spot in one spot and basically confirm that there was a tumor there. But one interesting thing is the scan only took 5 minutes to take a series of images over a 180-degree turn. But it took 2.5 hours to process the data from the computer.
Yeah, in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Now it's flipped. Well, flipped as in it's probably faster for the computer to process.
I think so, yeah. Although they start taking more and more scans.
Yeah.
So it throws it off a little bit too.
Right.
But you could see why it took until the 70s to do this, because if it took 2.5 hours, and there's still the very early days of computer technology. Also, they only ended up with that 2D image, so it wouldn't have been useful for any sort of modeling inside dinosaur brain cases or a lot of the CT uses we have today.
Right.
In order for that, we needed a technology called micro CT scanners. At least that's what you need for something like paleontology, where you want to see fine details of the bone. It creates a high resolution and 3D image. Micro CT scanners were not developed for humans. Instead, they were developed by Lee Feldkamp, who is a Ford Motor Company physicist. Didn't know Ford Motor Company had physicists.
I'm sure they had a lot of researchers.
Yeah. So he was looking for a way to find structural defects in automotive ceramics. And he came up with a way to rotate a sample 360 degrees versus 180 degrees in the older scanners. And then he came up with a way to make 3D images using what they call a cone beam algorithm. And he happened to run into somebody from the Henry Ford Hospital who was really interested in this. And they ended up scanning someone's hip after a biopsy. And the first data I could find anywhere was that in 1983, that micro CT scan data of that hip was presented. 1 year later, in 1984, is the first reference I could find for paleontologist CT scanning skulls.
That's pretty quick.
It is. It was Conray and Vanier who scanned a Miniochirus, which is a dog-sized mammal. I might have pronounced that wrong. But they weren't using a micro CT scanner. They didn't have access to that. They were using one that could do quote unquote high resolution, which was 256 by 256 pixels.
Ooh.
And it did 50 scans through it to give some 3D depth, which is really where the value came for the paleontologists, because they're not looking for just a slice to get some sort of diagnostic criteria. They want to literally look through some rock, see what's inside. They said, quote, "The computer programs can dissect the skull in different planes by making portions of it and any obstructing matrix transparent in order to reveal intracranial morphology," end quote.
All those layers come together and give you a fuller picture.
Yeah, and you can see the shape of the whole skull without having to get rid of the matrix around it, which is really nice.
Yeah, don't mess with the matrix.
Well, this is talking about the rock
I know.
around a fossil, but yeah. One funny thing is they note in the paper that the method has already been used to scan, quote, over 500 patients.
Yeah.
Which is just really funny to me because in the US, 72 million scans were done in 2007 alone.
Well, that's how technology goes.
Yeah. But it shows you how quick the paleontologists were to jump on this technology, that they were like, oh, they're using this on humans. I got a skull. I want to get that in there.
Well, it's like Phil Currie said. you're able to use a lot of different techniques and technologies
Yeah.
and programs.
They also had to do a couple workarounds because these were all designed to work on human skulls and heads with, still flesh around them. So what they did is they put the skull in water, and that helped simulate the soft tissue around the skull and gave them a better resolution and better results. So they soaked it in water while they were doing it.
Clever.
Yeah. In the early 2000s, there was still a mix of taking endocasts and even some destructive tests going on alongside CT scanning of dinosaur brain cases. So it wasn't an overnight switch where everybody flipped over to CT scanning. They're also probably quite expensive and hard to access for a while, too.
Mm-hmm.
There were a series of impressive papers by big names like Whitmer, Sampson, and Holliday, who successfully changed the focus to CT scanning by the late noughties.
Yeah, you just wanted to say late noughties.
It did.
2000s.
That's how they say it in the UK, and I like it way better. And now we see these just scans all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Not just of brain cases, but we see it of the bone tissue itself. There was even some presentations at SVP basically saying we might not even have to do a histology on long bones in the not too distant future because you can get really high resolution of long bones and see lags and things like that just by CT scanning them, which is really amazing. There's also a new technology coming up called photon counting CT.
Oh my goodness. Counting photons, that is very detailed.
Yeah, it's really cool. That one was just FDA approved in 2021, and like the name implies, it can count individual X-ray photons and measure their intensity, which leads to even more detail. So it's not just counting the photons, but it's measuring the intensity of those photons.
Huh.
A big benefit to this for people is that it can use far less X-rays and reduce radiation exposure to humans.
That's good.
Because as CT scans are doing, hundreds or thousands of X-rays, that can be a significant amount of radiation exposure. It's gotten a lot better with newer CT scanners that are more sensitive, so they don't need as much exposure. But the more you can reduce it, the better, especially when you're working on kids. So although that's really helpful for humans, with dinosaurs, we don't care. A lot of times the strategy with dinosaurs and fossils in general is to stick it in the highest possible power X-ray machine you can find anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Which is what they do. They go to the big European synchrotron, which just cranks those X-rays up to just, basically like lethal levels of power and blasting into the rock. And then you can really see through the density. Even when there's a bunch of metal in the matrix, sometimes you can still get some information from it. And it doesn't matter because they're dead. So just really blast them. So I was thinking, okay, maybe photon counting CT might not be super useful for dinosaurs, but they do say it can, quote, reconstruct images at a higher resolution, end quote, which would be useful because the more resolution, the better when you're scanning things. And I think we might be able to get the best of both worlds by combining photon counting with a synchrotron. You could do like really high power X-rays that could go through a whole bunch of matrix and bone and then measure the intensity of it on the other side more precisely with photon counting. So I'm hopeful. Seems really cool.
It does.
Unfortunately, this isn't going to help with a ground penetrating thing because you need a sensor on the other side of it. Unless I guess it's on a hill. Maybe you could shoot through a whole hill or a pyramid going all the way back to the original intention. I don't know.
Possibilities for sure.
Yep.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Again, if you want links to all the sources we discussed, then check out iknowdino.com in the show notes. And stay tuned for next week's episode, which may or may not be April Fool's Day related and may or may not be a bit late for that. It could still be enjoyable.
Yep.
Thanks for listening, and until next time.